Recording. Okay, cool. Week 8. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Um, what do I need to give you a reminder about tonight? Look, I think we're going to jump into the week's content. I think we just have a little bit of a revisit of the reframing around what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, a bit of the medical model. Um, and then we look at the 4 Rs of trauma-informed care, the trauma-informed principles in practice, and a bit of a window of tolerance conversation. And then if we have time, we'll have some case studies, but I just want to make sure I leave enough room for questions and things, given that I'm not here week 9. So look, I think I've given everyone 17,000 reminders now, but just wanted to let everyone know the workshop for week 9 is actually already on the Moodle. So if you are a keen bean, you could watch it now. Otherwise, just watch it in week 9 when you come back. Enjoy your break, eat chocolate, have some time off. Okay. Just wanted to do a quick recap. Last week we spoke about reframing the medical model into a trauma-informed approach. And I guess I wanted to just kind of revisit that we're not trying to discount the medical model entirely. It obviously has its place in the world and, a pretty significant one. Um, but, the trauma-informed approach is just another different approach that we can use. And obviously it has some, pretty clearly opposing views. So just remembering that the medical model is placing the emphasis on the individual. So we look at reasons why someone's behavior or presentation doesn't fit into the scope of what we would call the accepted norm. Um, and the medical model attributes mental abnormalities much the same as physical ones. So, just like the medical model would say, there are biological underpinnings for things like kidney function or heart disease. It would also say there are hereditary or biological contributors to things like depression and anxiety. Whereas if we look at the trauma-informed approach, it's really about understanding what circumstances led to the person using their current coping mechanisms. And are they functional? Right. So remembering that trauma is something that overwhelms someone's coping resources, what is the function of that behavior? And if we look at something like aggression as a coping mechanism, aggression can be really functional because if someone's calling you to offer you a service, or if someone is, knocking on your door saying, hey, I'm mandated to be here and offer you something, and you respond with aggression, chances are that service or that person is going to move away or disengage. And so for that purpose, it might actually be very functional if you're not willing already to work on whatever that service is offering you. So whilst, you might look at it from a bigger point of view and say, well, it's not functional because that person needs to engage in therapy. For that person who's not ready to engage in therapy, it's a very functional response. Does that make sense? So we really need to look at people's behavior and what purpose is that serving for them. Um, so yeah, instead of seeing trauma responses as mental illnesses or medical issues or disorders and abnormal behavior, we would look at that trauma response as being normal and rational and purposeful, and to an extent expected and justified. So yes, it sits very much sort of on the opposing side of the medical model, um, and kind of makes us question the context and the environment and the situation that's sitting around that person. So we just need to have a bit of cognizance around that, and remember that all coping mechanisms have a purpose. Right. So whether it's eating, taking drugs, not eating, hurting yourself, working too much, punishing yourself, becoming a perfectionist, overachieving, changing something about yourself, all of those coping mechanisms really come down to one of two purposes. It's either to keep ourselves from being really overwhelmed with feelings and memories that we can't cope with, or to reduce how powerless or hopeless we feel. So they really boil down to those two. What's the purpose of that coping mechanism? What's it doing for that person? Okay, so one of the key assumptions that underlies trauma-informed care is this concept of the 4 Rs. So the first R stands for the realization that trauma can and does occur every day, all the time, to any demographic of people. And with that understanding comes an understanding of the effects that it can have on people. So we know this happens. We know that, it can manifest in a lot of different ways, but not just individually, also for the collective. So, for communities like those that are impacted by a disaster or the stolen generations, for example, this concept of a shared and collective grief or experience. It can also be experienced by communities and individuals on a spiritual level. So something like reproductive or birth trauma, for example, can really challenge someone's concept of religion or spirituality. And that realization also means we recognize the different types of trauma that can occur, like we spoke about in the first few weeks, like physical and psychological and emotional trauma. And it involves being aware of the various ways that trauma manifests itself through physical symptoms and people's behavior changes and emotional disturbances. So I know it sounds a little bit silly, but having an understanding of that on principle is our key bottom line. And, as we know, unfortunately, not all people or organizations kind of start off from that baseline. If we move on to the recognize, this is really talking about the signs of trauma in individuals and in groups. So it's going beyond having an understanding that the signs of trauma exist, but also being able to recognize something as a trauma response. So a change in behavior or emotions, a change in someone's physical health, changes in cognitive functioning. And I know this sounds really like kind of common sensey, but it is really hard. I think when organizations are, stuck in the day-to-day grind, when managers are very, very busy or swamped or, the organizations are understaffed, it can be very hard to stop and recognize something as being a trauma response. I can remember working as a manager in the child protection unit that dealt with very significant child abuse. We worked next to the child abuse squad. And having a caseworker one day say to me, "Oh, yeah, I like vomited on the way to work this morning." And, I look back at that now as a very informed educator, an adult educator, and someone who was not, any longer in the hustle and bustle of that industry, and can look back at that and clearly recognize that as a trauma response and probably vicarious trauma. But at the time, it's your go-to to say, "Oh, you've got a stomach bug or something, go home," right? Go see a doctor, like go and rest. And, it's too easy to brush that over, and I guess not come back to it. So when she felt better the next day, that was that. But it did become obvious, in the coming weeks after that she was feeling some very significant vicarious trauma impacts. And, it took some time for that to be able to be recognized. So this common sense idea of, oh, well, we know all of these things exist, and it's easy when you have this big checker box to say, "Oh, not sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night thinking about work," and all these nice kind of tick boxes, I suppose. But in the heat of the moment, when an organization is busy and big things are happening, it can be hard. It can be really hard to recognize that is a sign of trauma. The other thing it needs to be able to recognize is the signs of trauma in groups, right? And I guess the child protection industry is one big group of people that are very, exposed to trauma all day, every day, and are very, very highly susceptible to things like vicarious trauma. But again, if you have things like increased conflict in a team, increased aggression, decreased communication. Sometimes, on the surface, that looks like, something that needs to be performance managed. It doesn't look like, signs of trauma. And I think, to be fair, many organisations and parts of the community fall down on this tier, this recognised tier. We're still seeing, performance management play out all the time when it might well be the case that that client or that employee, is being sexually harassed in the workplace. So rather than looking at someone disengaging from the workplace as a trauma response and a sense of avoidance and not wanting to run into the person who's done that to them, they look at it through a lens of productivity and say, well, you're not turning up to work on time every day and you're having a lot of sick leave, and let's have a look at a performance management plan. It's the go-to, right? So I think we have to just try and get a little bit better systemically at looking at this tier beyond just PTSD and understanding that a lot of trauma symptoms are experienced every day in different ways that people don't necessarily identify as being a trauma response. I know I talk about her all the time, but Dr. Jessica Taylor over in the UK has got, GPs and psychologists and psychiatrists sometimes use the DSM, so Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And it's got all of the mental illnesses in that manual and all of the, the characteristics that you need to meet a diagnosis and so forth. And Dr. Jessica Taylor did a lot of work around what is the trauma-informed version of the DSM. And so she has a book called the Indicative Trauma Manual. So basically, instead of a manual of disorders and pathologization, it's her manual for trauma symptoms, where people can look that symptom up and understand it through a trauma lens, which is very cool. The third one is having a system that responds to trauma. We're working really hard, I think, as a big industry, community services, to create these spaces, but we have a long way to go. And, this is about fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policy, procedure, and practice. So not just kind of having, a couple of managers in the industry or in the organization that say, yeah, we know all about this stuff, but truly integrating that into the organization, making sure that trauma and vicarious trauma are in policy and procedure and practice. And it's hard. We have a long way to go on this one, primarily because a system is made up of people, and we're really still skilling up the industry in those first 2 points. We're really still teaching people. So we need a whole bunch of people, going out and doing trauma-informed care and implementing that from the top of an organization all the way down to the bottom. So this kind of pillar entails having an understanding of all the different various interventions that are, available to people impacted by trauma. So it might be psychotherapy, it could be medication, support groups. If you're looking at an organization, it could be counseling, internal and external to the workplace. So not just EAPS, but also, who's somebody external to the workplace that you might be able to go and contact, external supervision. It might be vicarious trauma supervision. But also having a system in place that identifies and responds to signs of trauma, So if you have vicarious trauma supervision, you are sitting down and looking at what symptoms are you experiencing. And, last time we met, you said that you were not sleeping very well. You had a case on your caseload that was really, sitting heavy with you, and you will wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. Where are you now? Like, what is that looking like? How are you sleeping? How are you eating? Are you spending enough time with your friends and family? Really unpacking what vicarious trauma actually looks like. At a recent training session I did, we spoke about the difficulties in some employees being able to access DV payments from HR without anybody actually knowing that's what it was. So a situation had occurred where a person using violence was working in the same organisation as the victim survivor. And there were some really hard decisions to be made about how that person could access this entitlement that the organisation said you're all entitled to this time off and this payment. But how do you access that when the person that is hurting you is within the same organisation? How is that money processed and the leave associated with it too, when, that person also works for the organisation? How do you make sure that's not on a pay slip? How do you document that? Do you go and seek, a doctor's certificate to say that's what's going on? And where do you record that? And who's got access to that from within HR? Sometimes organizations have huge HR departments, How do you deal with the threat of somebody in a workplace that has been established as a threat external to the workplace? It can be really, really complex. And, how do people know that that person's a threat if you need to keep the information confidential? So that sits in that little section. And then the fourth R is resistance to re-traumatization. So really being aware of how organizations, how systems can re-traumatize people. It might be through re-exposure to traumatic events or re-experiencing traumatic memories. In the above example, it might be that other people in the workplace know about the situation and, they all start talking about it. Or maybe someone goes to the person who's using violence and says, oh, yeah, hey, by the way, I think your wife's going to leave you. She's accessing DV leave, right? So that would be very re-traumatizing, I imagine. Another recent example of this that I've seen is around misgendering someone or outing someone's sexuality. And both of those are forms of sexual harassment. You might also look at having to repeat what has happened to you during a sexual assault in a courtroom and reliving that experience and experiencing that trauma response, especially in an environment where you may not actually feel very safe with the person sitting opposite you in the room, and not having any therapeutic assistance while you do it. So that also involves, I guess, developing strategies for preventing re-traumatization. So avoiding triggers, engaging in self-care if you're an employee. It might be flagging with your manager that certain topics or certain cases hit close to home for you and you need to keep a bit of a distance away from it. But these are our pillars. So one does not lead to the next. It's not like that in a linear fashion. Think of it as the four legs that hold up a chair. So all of them are important, and all of them underlie how we want our trauma-informed responses to be shaped in the workplace. Okay, let's have fun with a case study. I want to hear from you, what is the most trauma-informed response here and why? So Norman, who is 43, is receiving counselling from a local mental health clinic. He's currently working with an immigration attorney and is in the process of applying for his T visa, which is the visa that is required to migrate. When his counsellor expresses wanting to work through his trauma, Norman discloses that he was not physically restrained, but his documents were withheld by the immigration department. How should the counsellor respond? Why didn't you just leave? You didn't go through physical abuse, which is good. It seems like you went through a lot of trauma when you were there. How are you processing through it? And I think we can get through hard times. I'm sorry. Welcome, Charles. Asha, what do you think? Which one's the most trauma-informed response and why?
Oh, okay. I think it seems like you went through a lot of trauma when you were there. How are you processing through it? I don't know, mate. Probably not. Because
what makes you unsure?
Because you don't really know how that person would be feeling about it, and you don't really want to put a name on it.
Yeah, so you feel like it's making an assumption?
Yeah, like you wouldn't want to put a name on it, but then also saying, I think we could get through hard times. I'm sorry. That's just kind of like brushing it off,
Yeah,
you
it's
know?
minimizing it, isn't
So,
it?
yeah, so I reckon 3.
It's also, so I think we can get through hard times is sympathizing with him, but it's not
Yeah,
empathizing. So
yeah,
it's taking away his story and his current emotions,
yeah.
but sort of assuming that it's relatable to other time, something like a hard time. So it's minimizing it as well.
So I think 3
Yeah,
because,
you're right.
yeah, because at least it's saying like, oh, well, it seems like you went, well, it was very like tough or like
Yeah.
hard for you,
Yeah, it was traumatic. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So answer one is victim blaming. It assumes that he had the choice to leave because he wasn't physically restrained. Answer B is telling him that the emotional abuse that he endured is not as significant as physical abuse, really. And yeah, C is the most trauma-informed response. Not perfect, as you said, but the most trauma-informed response. So it's acknowledging that what he went through was very difficult. It's allowing Norman to speak about his own story in his own time. It's not kind of poking for details. It's just kind of saying how you're getting through it. All right, good pickup. Let's do another one. This is a long one. Sam is a counsellor on a national DV hotline. One night she gets a call from a woman named Bobby who's distressed and calling to talk through an episode of violence. Bobby has disclosed that her husband physically assaulted her and her 2 children were quite distressed in the room with her. Sam asks whether Bobby is alone and asks a few questions about the environment she's calling from. She asks what the children are doing, and Bobby agrees to put a movie on for them while Sam waits on the line. Sam asks Bobby what she needs to happen throughout the call for her to feel safe talking. She advises Bobby that part of her role is to assess immediate safety and asks if it would be okay to walk her through a series of questions that she needs to ask to establish immediate safety is present. At the end of the questionnaire, Sam tells Bobby she would like to refer her to be checked over by a nurse and asks how Bobby feels about that. Bobby agrees, and the two discuss what options there are for her: hospital presentation, urgent care clinic, or the local GP. Sam asks Bobby if she requires help to travel to the appointment and walks her through options to get to the treatment centre. Sam discusses the need to make a report to the Child Protection Agency as part of her role, explains when this needs to be done, and offers to share the details of the report with Bobby directly so she knows what will be included, including that Bobby has participated in a questionnaire about immediate safety that identifies how she protected her children in that moment. Bobby agrees at the end of the call to be referred to a counselling session. Sam asks whether she would prefer to speak with Leanne or David and advises the counsellor of her choice will contact her before the first appointment to walk her through the process of referral and ongoing support. Following the call, Bobby books in for a debrief with her supervisor. What has she done well? What do you like about Sam's response? Yeah, jump in, Asha.
Okay.
I think that she was really good in like the steps, like kind of like because through a situation which is very distressing and with someone's mind being in all over the place, especially with kids being involved and stuff, it would be really hard to like separate yourself. Okay, so these are the steps to go through. It's
Yeah.
just kind of like making it more not easy, but making it just a little bit more calm. So not like
Yeah.
over stressing it. And also getting, like agreeing for her to get a nurse out. So not saying like you have to get a
Yeah.
nurse, you have to do this, because otherwise that will just put so much stress on a person, I reckon. That's my opinion.
Yeah. She's been gentle with it. Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, I reckon it was pretty good the way, she wasn't talking at her, she was, saying,
Yeah.
talking with her, which is really
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. She's been quite collaborative, hasn't she?
Yeah.
Yep. Hi, Charles. What'd you spot?
totally agree with all the points of my colleague have raised and said, and I will just I'll add a little bit on it as well. First things I can see Sam here is very good listener.
Yeah.
That's the first point. Why am I saying this? Because he took her through every step by step.
Yeah.
That's the first things, like not just jumping all over, like bringing from the top or down or middle, but
Hmm.
taking by step until to the end. That's the second point. The third point I can say, Sam, is refer refer the refer to all the right places.
Hmm.
And while he's referring, he did not just, like how my colleague said, he did not push it on her, but give her choices.
Yeah.
So that's the 3 points that I can just say. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've picked up, whether you intentionally did that or not, both of you have picked up on a few of the trauma-informed principles there in terms of offering choice, in terms of being collaborative. So, asking what she needs to happen for her to feel safe. How will you let me know if you feel unsafe? They've given her the choice of gender in her counsellor. So there was another opportunity of choice there. I think the other thing is that they've built trust by being quite transparent. So here's what I need to do. Here's this report that I have to make and why I have to make it. But I'm happy to share the report with you so that you know exactly what I've put, right? I'm not going behind your back doing this. I'm being very clear upfront. This is a part of my role. But I really want to make it clear that you've been quite protective of the children in what's happened. So, you know, I think we captured safety there by making sure that the room was sufficiently private without interruptions. What are the kids doing? Can we put a movie on so that we can chat sort of uninterrupted? And she's been quite empowering. She's offered her lots of sort of active decision makings with regards to her care there as well. Um, the other thing is, if you noticed, she didn't say, "Oh, what happened? Tell me what happened." She's not interested in the gory details. She doesn't want to know, the blow by blow. She's established immediate safety, but has focused on support and immediate care. So she's doing that deliberately. She hasn't wanted to strengthen that neural pathway about, what happened. Let's revisit it, particularly given she's over the phone and particularly given she's with her kids. So, we don't need to revisit exactly what happened. But, she might inquire if it was a perfect response. She might inquire about whether something like that had happened before, because what we understand about domestic violence is that past risk predicts future risk. So in terms of, his use of violence towards her in the past, that would be a very clear predictor of the likelihood of future violence. But also it would unpack whether that's an escalation point. So if she says, "Oh yeah, he's yelled at me a few times, but this is the first time he's hit me," then someone could sit back and say, "Right, we've got a very clear, escalation point." But otherwise, a pretty good response, I think. Okay, I want to show you this little video now. The window of tolerance is such a good model. I love this model. I've used this with adults, I've used this with kids, I've used this with toddlers, and they can all understand it. So it's a model by Dan Siegel, who also is the flip the lid fellow. It goes for a couple of minutes. So I'll do what I normally do and mute, and then we'll come back and I'll just walk us a little bit more through this model. Okay. Sorry, I can't get rid of the advertising at the end of those videos. So she does a really good job of explaining this. So the window of tolerance is a psychological term first coined by Dan Siegel. If you're interested in trauma stuff, particularly with kids and adolescents, Dan Siegel's a great person to have on your radar. So he describes this window of arousal in which, a person can stay calm and connected. Sometimes in this model, you will see 3 rows and a ship in the middle going up and down. And the model kind of explains it as, the ship staying in this middle kind of ideal area, but sometimes bumped up into hyperarousal or dropped down into hypoarousal. When you're in that middle range, which is the ideal kind of window of tolerance, you're able to regulate and integrate the information that comes in through your senses. You're feeling calm, you can respond, not react. It's kind of like the optimal arousal zone, right? And when you're outside of that window, you get dysregulated, and often the fight, flight, freeze response is activated. So when you are kind of pushed up into hyperarousal, you have increased responsiveness. You maybe get anxious, angry, you feel out of control, you need to fidget, you need to move around. This is really, the sympathetic nervous system is kind of telling you we need to do something here. The thing is too, that with the window of tolerance model, it recognizes that you can move up and down and through that window of tolerance at multiple times during the day. So it's not just like, right, I'm out the inside of a window of tolerance and now I'm here full time. Some people's window of tolerance is relatively wide, right? So you can have a lot of stressful things kind of thrown at you. And if your coping mechanisms are solid, if you have an excellent ability to emotionally regulate, then you can kind of comfortably tolerate that emotional intensity. And you can experience all of those emotions like guilt or anger, and you kind of tolerate it pretty well, and you can think and feel and be flexible despite high kind of degrees of arousal. When you're in that window, you have access to your prefrontal cortex, so all of your executive functioning skills. You're organizing, you're planning, you're prioritizing. You can start actions and projects and you can stay focused on them. You've got good self-control, you can regulate your emotions. They're really important skills, executive functioning skills. They help us work, they help us stay in relationships, they help us problem solve. But when you're outside the window of tolerance, either up or down, you lose access to those executive functioning skills. And so sometimes we make panicked actions or reckless actions. Sometimes we go into hypoarousal and we have no action at all. We could be really flat and struggle to get off the couch and do anything. And we start to feel really overwhelmed and, unmotivated. So, each person will have different windows depending on what else is happening at any given time. You might be a person who's got a pretty solid window of tolerance, but then something really awful happens and, then you stuff up at work as a result because you're not sleeping very well, and now work's a little bit of an ordinary place to be because people are mad at you. And then you come home and, you've let something slip at home and disappointed someone. And all of those things combine to give you, for a period of time, a much smaller window of tolerance. And so then what happens is it's easier to bump you out of that window of tolerance. Does that make sense? The window gets smaller. So what we find is that kids who have experienced a lot of trauma, people who have had recent trauma, people who are still healing from things like sexual abuse and going through, the legal system and stuff, the window of tolerance can be quite small for those people. So it becomes even more important that the systems around them support them to regulate and support the right response. So, a really good example is I worked with a lady who When she was outside of her window of tolerance, more often than not, she was a hyper arousal gal. She went up. And one of the biggest kind of red flags that she was feeling really hyper aroused was that she got really sweary. So, you know, she would come into work, and she also was a bit of a tornado in the workplace. So she would come in and she would throw stuff around and chuck a bag down on the desk and traffic, you know, and she'd be swearing. And so you would kind of look at her and go, okay, like she's up there in that hyper arousal stage. So some people it's really obvious. For other people, it can be less obvious. If that makes sense. Mimi.
Oh, I found the phone response kind of hard to fit in this explanation. I mean, phones kind of it could change a person's like personality to calm or respond to that. It's that maybe abuse or that I found it kind of it's hard to fit in this distinctive explanation.
Probably because it could go between both, but I would suggest a fawn response would sit in hyper arousal, only because usually a fawn response is somebody becoming hyper aware of everything around them and being very hyper vigilant and conscious of what's happening and adjusting themselves around what is happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in that respect, your nervous system would be very wired, trying to stay very alert as to what's happening. But then I would say if you are triggered into a fawn response, then perhaps you could sit in hypoarousal as well. So freeze is clearly a hypoarousal. That is your nervous system absolutely overwhelmed and shutting down that freeze response. But yeah, I think fawn would sit up there in increased responsiveness, because you are really, that's what you're doing. You're reading the other person's reaction and trying to stay one step ahead of it by, you know, giving that person what they want, so to speak.
Kind of hybrid.
Yeah. Yep. So look, I know that's a whirlwind explanation of the window of tolerance. If you plan on going into education, if you plan on working with kids, if you plan on working in anything trauma related, this model is so helpful because it gives people some really clear language to go, yep, I'm totally outside my window of tolerance, you know. And this can happen 10 times in a day, right? Because we know that the nervous system can then re-regulate and bring us back down. So I'm outside my window of tolerance. Yesterday, I went to the Sydney Kings game and sat for 55 minutes in the car park trying to get out. I was absolutely outside of my window of tolerance. I was getting really cranky. I needed to wee and I was stuck in the car and I couldn't get out. So, you know, I got out on the road and I was fine. But you can go up or down multiple times in a day. And if you are generally doing kind of well, your window of tolerance is big enough that you might bump out of it a little bit, but then you come back down. But if there's a lot going on and your tank is empty and you don't have people around you that are holding you in that space, you know, some people's window of tolerance would be like this, and it really just wouldn't take much to bump them out of that. Asha.
I see it a lot with I'll give everyone an example. With I work with kids in a 3 to 5 room, and we have 10 children in there who have special needs.
Yeah.
Within a class of like I think half of the children have special need, diagnosed and undiagnosed. And there's me and another girl in the class because and sometimes when we're dealing with the children, and you know, it's like all kids and all adults, everyone has their days and everyone doesn't, you know, it's not so much smooth sailing, but like we like have to take it in turns, like we like do time out, and then the other, like one of us goes in, or even with the kids, like if like they're like, you know, just going, if they're just not in, you know, like don't want a bar of any of us, we just like, all right, just go to the quiet corner, like, you know what I mean, just like go read a book, or
Yep.
if you want your space, that's fine. Just go read a book and calm down and come to us when you want to. But yeah, it's like
Yeah.
they see it all the time, but it's
Yeah,
poor.
100%. Give a toddler a really shit sleep the night before and then ask them to do something at 2 o'clock in the afternoon that requires more than just concentrating on one thing.
No way.
And they'll all go outside of window of tolerance, right? Like
No
take
way.
a toy off them when they're not allowed to play with something. Tell them they can't swallow a battery when they're playing with something and they're tired.
It's a war zone.
And that's right. And all the reasoning goes out the window because that's that concept. Dan Siegel does a hand signal. So this is the brain stem here.
I've read
And
that.
this is the executive functioning. And so he says when kids have flipped the lid, the executive functioning is gone, right? So the brain stem is still here, and that's what's leading that child. So this concept of, temper tantrums and all the rest of it is the same thing. It's a kid, they've blown their top. They're outside the window of tolerance. There's no point sitting down and saying, if you touch the stove, you're going to burn your hand and then we'll go to the hospital and it will hurt a lot. No point. Kid's not listening. Lid is flipped, right? So all I care about is you stopped me from doing something that looked really fun. And so now I'm going to sit here and scream at you for 10 minutes. And it's the same with adults, right? Like we all kind of do that. And I think it's interesting because we have a natural inclination to one or the other. We're either a hyper arousal kind of person or a hypo arousal. The good thing about this model and what I really like about this model is it helps people work out what's going to work for me then, self-care wise. So I know I bang on about this all the time. I probably haven't with you guys yet. We haven't kind of got to that topic, but this concept of self-care is a bit of a bugbear of mine because I feel like when you're working in an industry that is hard and you are surrounded by trauma all the time, to tell someone, oh, go home and have a wine, right? It's really condescending and it doesn't help. It's this concept of go home and depress your nervous system by having a drink or, having a bath is the big one. I've never felt more like slapping someone than when they tell you after a hard day to go home and have a bath, right? Having a bath is basic hygiene. It's actually not something that you should be using as self-care time. If we are truly trying to take care of ourselves and our nervous system, we need to target our self-care stuff at this window of tolerance. Am I hyper aroused? Is my nervous system firing on all cylinders right now? Then I need to do self-care that brings me back down. So targeted self-care. So it might be meditation. It might be, getting a pedicure or something that you find quite relaxing. It could be massage. It could be coloring in. It could be listening to music, right? But it's a targeted self-care activity aimed at depressing the nervous system. If you are a hypoarousal kind of person and you are flat, then you need to increase your nervous system responsiveness. So it might be going for a run. Going for a run's my idea of purgatory. If you told me after a really hard day to go home and go for a run, I'd probably cry. For some people, though, that's really helpful for them. So it's kind of about identifying what will work for me, for my nervous system at the moment in terms of how I feel and on a scale of 0 to 10. Because if you're at a 0, you're catatonic on the couch and telling you to go home and have a wine is going to make you even worse. If you are a 9 on the hypoarousal and you're almost back up to your window of tolerance, then perhaps going for a run or doing 10 star jumps or getting out of the office and going for a walk for 10 minutes and getting your heart rate going and getting out in the sun is helpful, right? But same thing, if you tell somebody who's really hyper aroused and their nervous system is going crazy to go home and go for a run, that's probably going to make it worse because then their heart rate's going, 3 times as fast and, Pilates after work is needed. Look, I think I quite like this model for that. I quite like the simplicity of being able to say, I can actually feel that my nervous system is up here, so I need to bring it down into this, this middle area, or I can feel that I'm down there and I need to bump it up. I think that's a model that, in my experience, kids can understand really easily. Sometimes I've seen it as like red zone, orange zone, green zone. or different colored zones. So, I'm red zoning at the moment. So what do I need to do to bring myself a little bit more into like a yellow zone? So there's a lot of really good language around this model as well. There's heaps of good YouTube clips on it. If you think back to the one about trauma and the Hulk, right? Hulk is hyper aroused. He's blown his top. So we've got to bring him back down into, I can't remember his real name, into the window of tolerance bit. So they all kind of sit nicely in this model. Asha.
Sorry, I was just going to say, that's what we have at work, and it's actually does relate to the window of tolerance. With we have angry face, like like cooling down face and stuff. When we get the kids to actually, before we even put them up, to recognize what faces like means what, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it works. It really does work, and it's done wonders.
Yeah. Well, you're also teaching them emotional literacy.
Yeah.
Right. So, like that 2-year-old that stands in the corner and is like, I'm angry, like, oh, geez, okay, well, let's unpack 7 other emotions that might look like anger, but kind of look like the same thing. So you're teaching them to be able to recognize, oh, that's what this is. It's anger, or it's frustration, or I'm annoyed, or I'm overtired and overstimulated. Mimi.
I think the verbs make difference. I feel if I say I expand my window of tolerance and I stay within the window of tolerance, I feel differently. Like expand make me more powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And understanding too that you can go through 7 different varieties of this in a day. It's not permanent. It's not about saying to somebody you're burnt out, or like you're very, very stressed. It's just a case of kind of recognizing my bucket's pretty empty at the moment, so I've got to put something back into my bucket to help me become a little bit more functional. So I quite like it too. I'm a Dan Siegel friend. I also think the really good thing about this conceptualization, like I said, the windows are not fixed, but there's individual differences in the width, right? So you take somebody who's just come back from frontline work in Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran or Pakistan, or for God, like the whole Middle East at the moment, and their window of tolerance is going to be very narrow, right? If we take somebody who's just been on a meditation retreat and they've come home, their window of tolerance might be really big. If we look at kids who have a really shy temperament and who find, emotional intensity disturbing, and then put them in a classroom with a bunch of kids that have really unpredictable temperaments who have outbursts when they're outside their window of tolerance, and that will push them, right over the limit. Or kids that have like sound sensitivities and things, and it doesn't take much to kind of blow. So they're those kids that we sit back and go, far out, like 5 minutes ago I sat with him and he was fine. Like, what's happened? And they blow really quick because sometimes the bucket can be filling up, and we don't really see it until, we're right at the top. And so all of that kind of co-regulation stuff comes in there. So, the importance of coming up to someone and giving them a hug, is really calming to the nervous system. So I'm really conscious we're out of time. So I'm gonna park the strengths-based approach stuff. I think we can come back to this a little bit later in the semester. It is also another excellent model for us to unpack. So I'll park it until week 10. We'll have plenty of time. Is it you guys? It's you guys. Week 10 is Anzac Day and we don't have a workshop that week. So I'll find a way of jamming it in, whether I do another little side kind of video that explains that. But an opportunity to practice the strengths-based approach before the end of the semester is probably useful. Does anyone want assignment-related questions? I know a couple of you said you had questions. Are they this subject related or fields of practice related?
No, I don't have any questions. I haven't even read the assignment, honestly. That's due on the 3rd of May. I've been enjoying
It's like 5 weeks away. It's fine. You've got time.
But yeah.
I'm thinking it's a field practice, field what's
A placement
placement?
question.
field oriented, because it says in practice.
Okay, what I'll do then is turn off the recording. Charles, do you have anything, mate? I think these girls want to ask something that's not this subject
No.
related. You're all
No,
good?
I'm okay. I'm okay with